On a cold February evening in 2007, the tranquil streets of Macomb County, Michigan, became the setting for a mystery that would captivate the nation. Tara Lynn Grant, a loving mother of two and a successful business executive, vanished without a trace. Her husband, Stephen Grant, made tearful pleas to the media, begging for her safe return. He painted the picture of a devastated family man, desperate for answers. But the truth he was hiding was far more horrifying than anyone could imagine. The Grants seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, thriving careers, and two young children who brought them endless joy. Yet, behind the polished image, tensions simmered. Resentment festered in their marriage, as Tara's demanding career took her further from home. And while she worked tirelessly to provide, Stephen sought solace elsewhere, in the arms of their 19-year-old Nanny. What began as hidden discontent erupted into unimaginable violence, culminating in a discovery so shocking it would leave an entire community reeling. How could a family that appeared so perfect harbor such devastating secrets? And what kind of betrayal could drive a husband to commit an act so brutal it defied comprehension? Tara Lynn Grant was born and raised in a small town in Michigan. From a young age, she displayed a remarkable drive to succeed. With a sharp mind and a strong work ethic, Tara pursued her education and later graduated with a degree that propelled her into the corporate world. By her early 30s, Tara was thriving as a regional manager for a prestigious engineering company. Her job required her to travel frequently, both domestically and internationally, but she always made it a priority to come home to her family in Macomb County. To her friends and colleagues, Tara was the perfect example of someone who had it all. A loving mother to two young children, a devoted wife, and a respected professional in her field. Despite the demands of her career, Tara always found time for her kids, and those who knew her spoke fondly of the joy she brought to their lives. But as Tara's professional responsibilities grew, so did the pressures at home. Stephen Grant, Tara's husband, came from a much different background. Unlike Tara, Stephen struggled to find stability in his professional life. Early in their relationship, his charismatic personality and humor had been qualities Tara admired. But over time, their differences became more pronounced. When Tara's career took off, Stephen chose to stay at home and care for their children. Initially, the arrangement worked, with Stephen taking on the role of a stay-at-home dad, while Tara became the family's primary breadwinner. But as the years went by, resentment began to build. Stephen increasingly viewed Tara's long absences as a rejection of their family life. He began to feel trapped and unfulfilled in his role. Friends noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. What had once been easygoing confidence was now tinged with bitterness. Tara, for her part, believed she was working hard to secure a bright future for their children. Yet, the balance that had once defined their marriage began to shift under the weight of unspoken frustrations. Their love story, which had started with so much promise, began to show cracks. Arguments about Tara's travel schedule became more frequent. Stephen accused her of neglecting the family, while Tara felt that Stephen failed to appreciate the sacrifices she made to provide for them. What had once been a partnership of equals slowly unraveled, as unresolved tensions and unmet expectations created a chasm between them. In the spring of 2006, the Grant family welcomed a 19-year-old German au pair named Verena Dierks into their home. Verena was hired to help care for the two young children, a decision that seemed practical given Tara's frequent travel for work. To outsiders, Verena appeared to be a perfect fit for the family. She was friendly, diligent, and good with the children. But behind the scenes, her presence would introduce a dynamic that no one could have predicted. Stephen, who had already been feeling neglected and unappreciated in his marriage, found himself drawn to Verena. She represented something different from the tension and resentment that had taken over his relationship with Tara. Young and attentive, Verena offered Stephen the admiration and companionship he felt was missing from his life. As Tara's work trips kept her away from home, Stephen began to confide in Verena, sharing his frustrations and feelings of inadequacy. What started as casual conversations between the two quickly evolved into something deeper and more dangerous. The affair began in secret, with Stephen and Verena navigating their stolen moments carefully. The secrecy itself seemed to fuel Stephen's infatuation, giving him a sense of control he felt he lacked in his marriage. But this clandestine relationship wasn't just about physical attraction. For Stephen, it became an emotional escape from the realities of his life. He viewed Verena as someone who understood him in a way Tara no longer did. In his mind, she was the antidote to his feelings of rejection and failure. As the affair progressed, it began to take a toll on the household. Stephen's behavior toward Tara became more erratic. He was distant during her brief periods at home and critical of her absences. Verena's presence, once seen as a helpful addition to the family, now added an unspoken tension. Tara, though likely unaware of the affair, sensed something was wrong. Their arguments became more frequent and heated, with both Stephen and Tara growing increasingly dissatisfied and angry. But the relationship between Stephen and Verena was not built to last. By early 2007, Verena decided to end the affair. The reasons remain unclear, whether it was guilt, discomfort, or simply the realization that the relationship could not continue. What is certain is that Verena's departure left Stephen feeling rejected and desperate. He had already spent months channeling his frustrations with Tara into his attachment to Verena, and now that attachment was suddenly gone. This added another layer of instability to an already volatile situation. The tension in the Grant household reached its breaking point, setting the stage for the events that would follow. It was February 9, 2007, a cold winter night in Macomb County, Michigan. Tara Grant had just returned home from a week-long business trip, a routine she and her family were all too familiar with. The house, quiet but tense, reflected the dynamic that had become common in recent months. Stephen, her husband, had been growing increasingly bitter about her frequent travel, and this night would be no different. Stephen later claimed that the evening began with a small argument, one that quickly escalated. According to him, the fight centered on the usual frustrations, her absences, her work, and the growing distance between them. Tara, tired from her trip and likely aware of the growing strain in their relationship, didn't back down. The argument reached a fever pitch, and Stephen said that Tara eventually stormed out of the house in frustration. He claimed she walked out into the freezing night, leaving her phone behind and telling him she needed space. But something about this story didn't sit right. Tara's family, especially her sister, Alicia Standerfer, knew Tara well. Tara was a dedicated mother who would never simply leave her two young children behind, especially not without her phone or her belongings. When Alicia couldn't reach Tara in the following days, her worry deepened. Tara's absence from family calls and obligations was completely out of character. Despite Stephen's reassurances, Alicia's instincts told her something was wrong. She grew more vocal, pressing for answers and urging authorities to take her sister's disappearance seriously. Alicia wasn't alone in her concerns. Friends and colleagues who had worked closely with Tara echoed similar sentiments. This wasn't just a mother taking time away. This was something far more alarming. Stephen, meanwhile, presented himself as a concerned and distraught husband. He told police and anyone who would listen that he was desperate to find Tara, even going so far as to make public pleas for her safe return. But his story began to show cracks. Why would a devoted mother leave her children without explanation? Why hadn't Stephen reported her missing until 5 days later, on Valentine's Day? As the days passed, suspicion began to grow. The community that had once admired the Grant family now started to question the reality behind their suburban facade. Friends, neighbors, and investigators all began to wonder, did Tara simply walk away, or was something far more horrifying unfolding? When Stephen Grant finally reported Tara missing on February 14, 2007, 5 days after her disappearance, the Macomb County Sheriff's Office began their investigation. On the surface, it seemed like a standard missing person case. A wife leaves after an argument, and her husband waits, hoping she'll come back. But from the very start, the inconsistencies in Stephen's story raised red flags for investigators. Stephen claimed that Tara had walked out into the cold night on February 9th without her phone, purse, or any extra clothing. He insisted he hadn't heard from her since. Yet investigators couldn't understand why a devoted mother and professional like Tara would simply vanish without a trace. leaving behind her children and all her belongings. And why had Stephen waited so long to report her missing? While Stephen portrayed himself as a worried husband in his statements to the police, his behavior seemed odd. Instead of cooperating fully, he appeared overly concerned with how he was perceived. He gave lengthy interviews to local media, describing Tara's disappearance in dramatic terms and pleading for her safe return. These public appeals struck many as strange, not because he was speaking out, but because of the way he spoke. His tone seemed performative, rehearsed, almost as though he was following a script rather than expressing genuine emotion. Investigators pressed Stephen on his timeline and the events leading up to Tara's disappearance. Each time, his story seemed to shift slightly, adding more inconsistencies. He couldn't account for the hours immediately following her supposed departure, and when asked why he hadn't notified authorities sooner, his answers were vague and unconvincing. Meanwhile, Tara's family, especially her sister Alicia Standerfer, was growing more vocal. Alicia publicly expressed her doubts about Stephen's account. She knew Tara wouldn't have abandoned her children, and she began to question why Stephen seemed so focused on managing public perception rather than working with investigators to find his wife. Alicia's persistence added pressure to the investigation, forcing authorities to dig deeper into the Grants' lives. Within days, the sheriff's office brought cadaver dogs to the Grant property to search for any signs of Tara. The dogs were trained to detect the scent of human remains, even if they were hidden or decomposed. Almost immediately, they alerted to the family's garage, a seemingly innocuous space that suddenly became the focal point of the investigation. Forensic teams were brought in to examine the area further. The garage, once a quiet storage space, now hinted at something far more sinister. On March 2, 2007, nearly a month after Tara Grant was last seen, the investigation took a horrifying turn. Acting on mounting suspicions and the earlier cadaver dog alerts in the garage, investigators secured a search warrant for the Grant home. What they discovered would shock even the most seasoned detectives. In the Grant family garage, hidden in a large plastic container, investigators found dismembered human remains. Forensic analysis would later confirm what everyone feared: the remains belonged to Tara Grant. The discovery marked a turning point in the case. Tara was no longer missing. She had been brutally murdered. Stephen Grant, who had been under increasing scrutiny, fled the house upon learning of the search. His sudden disappearance only added to the evidence against him. 2 days later, after being captured in a wooded area suffering from frostbite and hypothermia, Stephen finally broke down and confessed to what had happened on the night of February 9th. According to Stephen, the night began like many others, with tension and arguments. Tara had just returned from a week-long business trip, and Stephen, as usual, resented her absence. The argument escalated when Tara allegedly threatened to leave him and take the children with her. Stephen claimed these words sent him into a blind rage. In that moment, he grabbed Tara by the neck and strangled her. By the time he realized what he had done, Tara was dead. But what followed her death was not the act of a panicked man. It was something far more calculated and chilling. Stephen didn't call the police or seek help. Instead, he allowed hours to pass, and as the reality of his crime set in, he decided to take steps to cover it up. Stephen later admitted to dismembering Tara's body using a hacksaw he found in the garage. Piece by piece, he methodically cut her remains, an act so gruesome it shocked everyone who heard the details. He stored parts of her body in the same garage where the cadaver dogs had alerted weeks earlier. For several days, Tara's remains sat there as Stephen continued to play the role of a concerned husband in front of the media and the community. Eventually, Stephen decided he needed to dispose of the remains. Under the cover of night, he drove to Stony Creek Metropark, a wooded area not far from their home. There, he scattered parts of Tara's body, believing the wilderness would hide his crime forever. He even attempted to bury some of the remains in shallow graves. But Stephen's actions were anything but the result of panic. Investigators would later describe his behavior as cold and methodical. Every decision he made, from the dismemberment to the disposal, was calculated, designed to conceal the crime and shift suspicion away from himself. He returned home after these late-night trips resumed his role as a father to his children, and continued to insist to anyone who would listen that he had no idea where Tara had gone. The discovery of Tara's remains in the garage, coupled with Stephen's confession, revealed the full extent of his betrayal. What had started as an argument fueled by resentment and frustration had spiraled into an act of unimaginable violence. The community, already reeling from Tara's disappearance, was now faced with the horrifying truth of what had happened to her in the place she should have felt safest, her own home. As the gruesome discovery of Tara Grant's remains in the family garage came to light on March 2, 2007, Stephen Grant's carefully constructed facade crumbled. That same day, Stephen fled his home, abandoning his 2 young children without explanation. His disappearance triggered a massive manhunt, one that spanned multiple states and captivated the nation. Stephen's flight began with his car, which he drove erratically before abandoning it near Mount Clemens, Michigan. Investigators found the vehicle parked near a commercial area, with no sign of Stephen nearby. The discovery of the car intensified the search, as it became clear he was now on foot and potentially dangerous. Law enforcement agencies coordinated a multi-state effort to track him down, deploying helicopters, search teams, and tracking dogs. Stephen's face appeared on news broadcasts nationwide, marking him as a fugitive on the run. As authorities combed through the surrounding areas, Stephen attempted to navigate the harsh Michigan wilderness. He had no plan, no supplies, and no preparation for the freezing February nights. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and the dense woods offered little shelter. Stephen's escape quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. For 2 days, Stephen evaded capture, but the brutal conditions began to take their toll. He trudged through snow-covered fields and thick forest, seeking refuge wherever he could find it. By the evening of March 4, 2007, law enforcement received a tip about a man matching Stephen's description in Emmett County, near Wilderness State Park in northern Michigan. Officers rushed to the area, and their search ended when they found Stephen lying in the snow, barely conscious. When they approached, Stephen was visibly suffering. His body was ravaged by frostbite and hypothermia, and he was weak from exposure and dehydration. He could barely speak, his lips blue and his movements sluggish. Paramedics were called to stabilize him before he could be taken into custody. Even in his weakened state, Stephen offered no resistance. The manhunt was over. After being treated at a local hospital for his injuries, Stephen finally spoke to investigators. His confession was chilling. He admitted to killing Tara in a fit of rage, dismembering her body, and attempting to conceal the crime. His escape, he explained, had been an impulsive act, driven by panic after the police found Tara's remains in the garage. Stephen's capture marked the end of a tense and dramatic chapter in the investigation. What began as a quiet missing person case had transformed into a nationwide manhunt and a tragic revelation of betrayal and violence. As he was led away to face justice, the community that had once embraced the Grants as a model family now grappled with the shocking reality of what had unfolded in their midst. After his capture and confession, Stephen Grant faced a legal reckoning that would lay bare the horrifying details of his actions. His trial began in December 2007, nearly a year after Tara's murder. By this time, the case had captured national attention, and the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and grieving family members. Stephen's defense strategy relied on portraying him as a man who acted out of momentary rage, not premeditated intent. His legal team argued that the murder was a crime of passion, sparked by the heated argument with Tara on the night of February 9, 2007. They emphasized Stephen's claim that he was overwhelmed when Tara allegedly threatened to leave him and take the children. But the prosecution presented a starkly different narrative. They described Stephen as a manipulative and resentful husband who had allowed his jealousy and insecurities to fester until they erupted into violence. The prosecution detailed not only the murder, but also the calculated dismemberment and disposal of Tara's remains. This, they argued, was evidence of a man who was not acting out of temporary insanity, but rather taking deliberate steps to cover up his crime. The emotional weight of the trial came to a head when Tara's sister, Alicia Standerfer, took the stand. Alicia spoke about Tara's love for her family and her dedication to her children. Her voice trembled as she described the devastation left in the wake of Stephen's actions. Alicia also highlighted the lasting impact on Tara's children, who had been robbed of their mother and left to grapple with the knowledge that their father was responsible. Her testimony was a powerful reminder of the human cost of Stephen's betrayal and violence. Throughout the trial, Stephen's demeanor drew scrutiny. He appeared remorseful at times, breaking down in tears during certain testimonies. Yet, many saw his emotions as self-serving, a stark contrast to the cold and calculated nature of his crime. The prosecution capitalized on this perception, painting Stephen as a man who only showed regret when faced with the consequences of his actions. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Stephen Grant was found guilty of second-degree murder. The conviction reflected the jury's belief that while the crime may not have been premeditated, it was far from an accident. Stephen was sentenced to 50 to 80 years in prison, a sentence that effectively ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The aftermath of the trial left Tara's family and community grappling with the tragedy. Alicia Standifer became a vocal advocate for her niece and nephew, ensuring they were surrounded by love and support in the absence of their parents. She also worked to raise awareness about domestic violence, urging others to recognize the warning signs before it was too late. In Macomb County, the Grants' once idyllic home stood as a grim reminder of the darkness that had unfolded within its walls. The community, once a picture of suburban tranquility, was shaken by the realization that such horror could exist in their midst. For Tara's family, the pain of her loss was compounded by the betrayal of someone they had trusted. Yet they found strength in honoring her memory, remembering her as a devoted mother, a loving sister, and a woman who worked tirelessly to build a better life for her children. Stephen's conviction brought a sense of closure, but the scars of his actions would never fully heal. As he serves his sentence, the legacy of his crime continues to be a cautionary tale about the destructive power of unchecked anger, resentment, and betrayal. As we reflect on Tara Grant's story, one pressing question remains. Could this tragedy have been prevented if the hidden tensions in her marriage had been addressed? This case serves as a stark reminder of how infidelity, resentment, and unresolved anger can fester into something catastrophic. The consequences of Stephen Grant's actions were not just the loss of Tara's life, but the devastation of their family and community. It's a sobering reminder to pay attention to the signs of domestic turmoil, whether in our own lives or those of others. Open communication, seeking help, and addressing issues early can prevent tragedy. Tara's story reminds us of the devastating cost of silence and unresolved conflict. Let it serve as a call to recognize and address the struggles that too often remain hidden behind closed doors.